In the winter of 1914, the world found itself ensnared in the devastating grip of the Great War. The Western Front, a vast and muddy expanse of trenches, lay sprawled across northern France and Belgium, where British and German soldiers, entrenched in a bitter stalemate, faced each other in a cold, unforgiving landscape. The war had ground on for months, turning the fields into a nightmare of craters and barbed wire, and the men, hardened by constant bombardment, had long since abandoned any hope of a swift victory. Death, like a shadow, loomed over the soldiers, who were trapped in a battle that seemed endless, their lives reduced to nothing more than surviving the brutal conditions and the ever-present fear of enemy fire. It was into this hellish world that Christmas arrived. For most, it was just another day in the trenches, another day of cold and mud, of waiting for the next battle, of praying for a respite that seemed as distant as the stars. The men had grown weary of the endless slaughter, and though Christmas was a time of joy and togetherness for families back home, for the soldiers in the trenches, it was a painful reminder of the distance that separated them from loved ones, from the lives they had once known. But on the night of December 24, 1914, something extraordinary happened. Something that no one could have predicted. Something that would forever change the course of that bitter winter, even if only for a brief moment. As the evening fell, the soldiers in the German trenches began to sing. At first, it was faint, a distant, almost ethereal sound that drifted across the frozen ground. It was the familiar melody of Stille Nacht, Silent Night, the beloved Christmas carol that had been sung for generations. The gentle tune, sung in unison by the men, carried across the barren expanse of no man's land, the space between the opposing trenches where so many lives had been lost. The haunting beauty of the song seemed to echo through the very soul of the battlefield, as if the song itself were trying to pierce the heavy gloom that had settled over the war-torn landscape. The British soldiers, huddled in their own trenches, were initially suspicious. Could it be a trick? Were the Germans attempting to lure them into the open, to ambush them? For a moment, the men were unsure, paralyzed by the instinct for self-preservation that the war had instilled in them. But as the song continued, something in the melody stirred a deep, undeniable feeling in their hearts. It was a tune that transcended language, that transcended borders, and for the first time in what seemed like forever, the soldiers were reminded of something beyond the war. They were reminded of home, of the peaceful Christmases they had once known, of a time when the world had not been divided by gunfire and bloodshed. Cautiously, the British soldiers began to respond. One by one, they lifted their voices, joining in the familiar carol. The cold, brittle air that had once seemed so hostile now seemed to warm, as if the very earth itself was drawing breath. The two sides, separated by mere yards of blood-stained soil and barbed wire, were now united by a song, by a shared humanity that neither side had expected to find on the battlefield. As the night wore on, the song gave way to silence. The world seemed to hold its breath. And then, at the stroke of midnight, the impossible happened. A lone figure emerged from the German trenches. He was a tall man, his face lined with exhaustion, his uniform worn and tattered by the rigors of the war. He held a small Christmas tree, a humble gesture, but one that spoke volumes. The tree, the modest, seemed to glow with the spirit of the season, a symbol of defiance against the darkness that had consumed the world. The man raised the tree high above his head, and with it, he offered a simple, powerful gesture: peace. The British soldiers, stunned at first, stared at the figure in disbelief. Was this a trap? Was it some kind of ruse? But as the minutes ticked by, they saw no weapons, no signs of deceit. And then, from the depths of their own trenches, one British soldier stepped forward. He was hesitant at first, his heart racing with fear, but the allure of that simple act of peace proved stronger than the instinct to fight. He climbed out of the trench, cautiously crossing the uneven terrain of no man's land. Soon, others followed, and before long, both sides found themselves face to face, in the very heart of the war, meeting one another as equals, as men, as brothers in arms. The two groups of soldiers stood in silence for a moment, the enormity of the situation slowly dawning on them. It was as if the war had ceased to exist for that fleeting moment, as if the pain, the fear, and the hatred that had defined their lives for so long had evaporated into the cold night air. They shook hands, exchanged greetings, and, for a short time, they forgot that they were enemies. They were simply human beings, caught in the same storm, yearning for the same things: peace, hope, and a return to the lives they had once known. the unspoken truce that followed was nothing short of miraculous. In the days that followed, the soldiers from both sides met in the middle of no man's land. They exchanged small gifts, cigarettes, food, buttons, and coins. They shared photographs of their families, and in doing so, they reminded each other that, beyond the battlefield, they were not so different. They were fathers, brothers, sons. They had once been farmers, bakers, workers, and artists. In that brief, precious moment, the war seemed a distant memory. And then came the most unexpected part of the truce. A young German soldier named Hans, a lover of football, produced a football from his pack. The sight of the ball brought a ripple of laughter, a break from the tension that had built up over months of fighting. Without a word, the soldiers began to form two teams. What followed was the most improbable of matches, a game of football in the middle of no man's land, between two armies that had once been sworn enemies. They kicked the ball back and forth, laughing as they played, their laughter filling the air, their spirits lifted by the sheer absurdity of the situation. The ground was uneven, the air biting cold, but for those precious hours, the war was forgotten. They were no longer soldiers, they were simply men, enjoying a game of football, a moment of joy amidst the carnage. For the first time in months, the soldiers could feel their hearts lighten, the weight of the war lifted, even if just for a brief while. The football match became a symbol of hope, of what could be achieved when humanity rose above conflict. As the evening wore on, the men returned to their respective trenches, the sounds of gunfire and artillery gradually filling the void left by the laughter. The ceasefire had been an unofficial truce, and the war, despite its temporary pause, was far from over. But as they returned to the horrors of the front lines, the soldiers carried with them something that could not be taken away, the memory of a Christmas that had transcended war. The memory of a fleeting peace that had blossomed, however briefly, in the midst of the most devastating conflict the world had ever known. Years later, when the soldiers who had witnessed the Christmas Truce of 1914 spoke of that day, they would call it a miracle. It was a moment when the world seemed to hold its breath, when time itself seemed to pause, and the men on both sides of the trenches realized that, beneath the uniforms and the rifles, they were all human. In that brief moment of peace, the soldiers had seen beyond the hatred, beyond the bloodshed, and had remembered what it meant to be alive. The Christmas Truce of 1914 became a symbol of hope, of peace, and of the enduring power of the human spirit. It was a reminder that, even in the darkest of times, there is always a possibility for light, for kindness, and for understanding. Even in the heart of war, there is room for humanity to shine. And though the war raged on, the memory of that Christmas would forever remain a beacon of what was possible when people came together, not as enemies, but as fellow human beings, united by the simple, powerful truth that peace is always worth fighting for.